In this video, I'll be demonstrating how to replace the head retainer in your PAT4.0 hand tool. This is a complicated repair, so please watch this video prior to replacing the head retainer. Here are a couple pictures of tools with good head retainers and broken head retainers. Prior to removing the housing on the PAT1M 4.0 hand tool, you want to make sure you're properly grounded with an ESD ground strap, as you can see that I am. This will prevent any damage to electronic components inside the hand tool. First, I'll be removing the left hand or top housing from the tool. So I have the 5-screw facing upward. And once you have all your screws loosened, you can just take and lift your top housing up off. Might be caught here. Go ahead and finish loosening. And then just take your top housing, set it off this side. And by the way, this piece here is a counterbalance holder, and I'm just going to set that off this side as well, but it goes right here when you put the tool back together. Next, I'll be turning the tool over and removing the 1 screw from the right hand or bottom housing. Flip the tool back over and just take the inner workings of the tool out and set the right hand housing and the screw on the side. Now I'm going to be using a 4mm nut driver to remove the 2 nuts from the top of the PC board. If you use a needle nose pliers, be careful. I had a colleague go to use it and the needle nose pliers slipped off and it hit the tracing on the top of the board and damaged it, so be careful with that. So again, with my 4mm nut driver, remove 1 nut and the other. Okay. And then what I'm going to do is just lift up the PC board, and then I have a couple ground terminals. You see one popped off already, and then the other one I'm going to do is just grab a little screwdriver here and help slide it up off the ground post. Okay. Okay, so I got them off. Now, I'm going to be removing this 1.5mm Allen screw here. There is a 2.5mm Allen screw here. So there's also a lock washer underneath there, so I'm just going to take, once I unscrew that, and lift that off, and again set it on the side. And then I'm going to flip the tool over. I'm going to hold this plate down, flip the tool over, and there is a M3 nut, and I have an M3 nut driver that I'm going to take and remove this from. Okay, and there's also, again, a lock washer on there too, so I'll take that and remove that. And then now, what I'm going to do is take and remove the bevel spur pin. Sometimes you need to tap on this to get it up or out of the plate, and take and push on it. And you'll notice I've taken the bevel spur pin out, and now I can take and lift this plate up off here, off the top of the tool here. After removing this plate, there is a spacer underneath your 2.5mm Allen head screw. So I'm just going to take and remove that. And now I'm going to take these 2 M3 bolts here. They go through the motor mount. They kind of connect the front of the tool to the back of the tool. So I'm holding my fingers up because there is a nut on the bottom of these screws. So I took and loosened that 1 screw, take the nut off here, and the same on the other. And again, I'm holding my finger up to keep that nut in position. So again, I have it unscrewed, push down, and here's the nut on the bottom here. Okay, got that off. And then what you can do is take and what I'm going to do is just flip this over and push the screws out here. They're the two M3 bolts. Okay. Set them on the side. All right. Now I'm going to take and disconnect the front and back of the tool. So what I'm going to do is just hold the tool, the front of the tool with my left hand back with my right hand. Just kind of wiggle it. If you can see, there's a spring right here. So I'm just going to take and carefully kind of pull it apart. You're kind of disconnecting the top up here. Once you have it pulled apart, I'm just going to take the back of the tool, flip it over, and leave it sit here. All the work I'll be doing now will be on the front of the tool. Also, there's a bevel spur gear here, and just so you know, there is a thrust washer that sits on the top of it. Sometimes when you're taking this apart, the thrust washer is actually sitting on the bottom of the motor mount piece here. So just make sure you have it for when you put it back together. And I'm going to set that on the side. Now, I'll be removing this gear here, and there is a little keyway on it. So I'm just going to take and lift up on this gear. And if you can notice here, there's a keyway right here. And if you take a look, there's a key here. And by the way, this gear has a boss on it, a little raised area here, and the boss or raised area faces down when you put it back together. So I'm going to set that on the side. And next, I'll take the little keyway out of the shaft here. And as you can see, it is very small, so just be careful that you don't lose that, because that connects the gear train together. Now, I'll be removing the top or left-hand side plate. And prior to doing that, I just want to take and turn my tension all the way down. Then, remove this E-clip off this post here. Then, there are two 1.27 millimeter Allen screws right here. And you can also use a 50 thousandths diameter Allen wrench if you don't have a 1.27 millimeter. So take and remove those two screws there. Okay. And now I'll be removing the top side plate. What you want to do is grab a small Allen wrench, and what I do a lot of times, I'll hold my finger in the back here. There's a spring in this area, but I'll go into the back of the tool and just grab the small Allen wrench and start creating a little bit of a gap. And if you can see the gap there. Anyway, I'm just creating a little bit of a gap with a small screwdriver, and I'm just kind of working my way around the plate. You don't ever want to pry up one side of the plate. So anyway, I've created a small gap all the way around. Then I'll come back with a bigger screwdriver, and again, I'm keeping my finger in the back here. So there's a spring that's under load there. So I'm just going to take and finish popping the plate off. Okay, I got the plate up. I'm just going to lift this up, and here's the head retainer spring which I was talking about that sits right in this slot in the back that's under tension. So I'm just going to take that and put it on the side along with my left-hand side plate. Now, prior to removing your tension shaft, just want to bring to your attention there are a couple tension setting balls, one on each side, one here and one here. So what I'll do is just hold this, and I grab the tension shaft and just kind of rotate it back towards you, like so. And then I have my tension shaft here, and as you can see, these little tension locking balls, I take and put them out here. So I'm just going to set them on the side for when I put the tool back together. Now I'll be turning the tool over and removing a small E-clip. This is a blade pin right here. So there's a 0.62 inch diameter E-clip, or I'm sorry, a 0.062 inch diameter E-clip, but I'm just going to pop it off. I grab a little screwdriver and pop this little E-clip off here, and then turn this back over, and then I'm going to grab I can push up on the blade pin from the bottom, but I normally leave the top E-clip on the blade pin, and then I'll just set that off on the side like that. And next, I'll be removing there's a link right here that connects the blade pin to the pin that moves the blade in the front in the headstop mount assembly. Then I'll be removing the tie guide, which sits over top of the head retainer. Okay. And then here's your head retainer. This is the piece that I will be replacing. Okay. Now I'll be replacing the head retainer by sliding it in like so. I don't know if you can see the hole in the head retainer. There's a lot of holes that I need to line up here. There's a hole in the leg of the D10 assembly, also in the link. So what I do is once I put the head retainer in position, I always make sure my D10 assembly is in the up position. I'm considering this the up position. Then what I do is grab my 1.27 millimeter Allen wrench. The other thing also is you notice there's a pin that moves the blade right here. You want that in the forward position. And again, my D10 assembly up. Grab my 1.27 millimeter Allen or 50 thousandths of an inch diameter Allen wrench. Make sure everything's lined up. I slid that in. Now I'm going to take my tie guide and slide it in. And every time I replace a piece, I just make sure that my holes are still lined up, so when I go to put the blade pin in, it's lined up. And the last piece here is my link. I'm going to slide it in, and then slide the front of the link over the pin in the headstop mount assembly that moves the blade. Again, make sure my holes are still all lined up, and they are. And then what I'm going to do is grab my blade pin that I left the E-clip on and just slide it through. So sometimes you got to wiggle it till you push it down and it gets all the way in position. And prior to putting on the bottom E-clip, I normally do that last because I don't want to lift the tool up and to turn it over to put that E-clip on. Now, prior to putting the tension shaft back in the tool, there are a few lubrication points. So I have some black moly grease here, so I'm going to throw a dab of black moly grease on the tip of the tension shaft here. And what I'm going to do is slide it in there's a hole in the cam where this tension shaft moves, so I put some grease there. Also in this little pocket where your tension's at on the right-hand side plate or bottom side plate. The same on the left-hand side plate, I'm putting a little bit. And there's also this right here, there's a bushing in the left-hand side plate. I'm throwing some grease in there as well. Now, I'll take my tension spring and put it back on the shaft. And what I'm going to do is, if you see this tension indicator here, it's rectangular shape. So what I'm going to do is have it set where it's more in a horizontal position initially, and I slide the tension shaft inside the hole in the cam here. So again, as you can see, it's horizontally. But what I do is I push in, and as I rotate this over the top, I spin it 90 degrees. And then what I'm going to do is take my tension indicator and make sure I have it seated in the tension window right here. Set that back down. Now I'll be installing the tension setting balls. And sometimes what I'll do is throw a dab of grease in the little pockets where they sit. It helps to keep them in position once you put them there. So I used that black moly grease. And I'm going to grab one of my tension setting balls, set it right there. And what I'm going to do is just grab a small screwdriver and slide it into position, like so. Take the other one and set it in position here. Okay. So now I have my two tension setting balls in position. Alrighty. And then what I'm going to do is grab my head retainer spring. And Panduit sells a head retainer spring insertion tool, part number WT24053B01. And at the front of it, it's like a feeler gauge. But what you can do is put your head retainer spring over the front of it. And there's a hole in the back of the head retainer where you put the head retainer spring. So what I'm going to do is slide it forward. Okay. So now I have tension, on the spring pushed forward. I'm going to grab my top or left-hand side plate, and what I do is I normally try to line up the back of it here close to my tension shaft. So I'm going to come in and slide this all the way to the back, and then the next thing I try to do is line up where the shaft is at right here in this bushing. So now what I'm going to do is just kind of come down from the top, and you want to push down evenly with pressure. So I'm just kind of working around the plate. And now I have the plate completely seated, and I can remove my head retainer spring. Set that on the side. And then what I'm going to do is put this E-clip on right here. Okay. And then my two little 1.27 millimeter Allen head screws. And again, just you want to finger tighten these screws. You don't want to over tighten them, because if you tighten them down too much, if you strip them out, you'll end up drilling them out. So just lightly tighten those screws. Now I'll be taking my bevel spur gear and putting it into position, but prior to that I want to put my thrust washer on there. A lot of times what I'll do is take a little dab of grease and put it on the top of the bevel spur gear. Take my thrust washer and put that in position like this. And then I'll grab my small screwdriver and just try to make sure it's centered perfectly. Take my bevel spur gear and set it right here. Then what I'm going to do is take the back of the tool with the motor and motor mount. And what you want to do here now is this spring right here sits on this nub of the rear jaw assembly, if you can see that right here. Okay, so what I'm going to do is set that spring, push it over that nub on the rear jaw assembly. Okay, and then what I'm going to do is pull down on the back of the tool, and I'm going to line it up right where my thumb's at. So I'm going to pull this down and get everything lined up, and then just snap it into position like that. Then what I'm going to do is grab my two M3 bolts that go through the motor mount and hold the front of the tool to the back of the tool. Snap them into position. Okay, I got those two in position. Now I'll be installing the bevel spur pin. So what I'm trying to do is push my bevel spur gear into position. What I do is just grab my little screwdriver here and try to make sure that thrust washer lined up perfectly. And take my bevel spur pin and kind of wiggle it into position. Maybe sometimes you need to move the gear around a little bit. Now you notice it's seated properly. All right. Now I'm going to put in my little input shaft key. There's a little tiny slot here in this shaft. So a lot of time what I will do is I'll grab a tiny dab of grease, put it on the tip of my screwdriver, and put my keyway right on the tip of it. And then what I'll do is make sure I'm lined up here right. And then now that you have your input shaft key in position here, what I do is I'll just take a small screwdriver and I hold it in position. I keep it pushed into the slot that it's in. And again, this gear here has got a boss or raised area on it. I'm going to face that down and then just line up the little keyway slot over the key. Now it's in position. Then I'm going to take this spacer that goes under my 2.5 millimeter Allen screw. And then I'm going to take this plate that has this gear on it, and I'm going to put it over the bevel spur pin. Just basically line this up. And sometimes you need to turn the gears a little bit to get that to drop into position. And now you can see, now that you can see that all the gears are connected, you can see me spinning them here. Then I'm going to take and put my 2.5 millimeter Allen screw head with lock washer on it. Just put it through here. And what I do initially is just kind of finger tighten everything. You don't want to, I don't tighten everything down until I have everything, the whole tool reassembled. So I have that, and I'll take my little 1.5 millimeter Allen screw here, and I'm going to put it in this hole here. Then I'm going to turn the tool over, and I'm going to grab this lock washer, and there's a M3 nut, and I'm going to get this started. And again, I'm going to grab my nut driver for my M3 nut and just kind of finger tighten it. Okay. Now I'll take and the M3 nuts that go on the bottom of the 2 screws that go through the motor mount. Again, I'm going to take and hold them up into position, and then go ahead and finger tighten these screws here. That one's on. And also, as you can see right here, I'm going to take and put that here. And then I'm going to tighten this. So again, all my screws and nuts are finger tightened, and as you can see, I can spin my gears relatively easily. And then what I do is I take and secure these down. I'm just going to snug them down. The 2.5 millimeter Allen up there, these 2 M3 bolts, good, snug them down good. And then when you're tightening up this M3 nut here, what I'll do is I grab a screwdriver and hold it in the slot in the bevel spur pin. And I'll come back with my M3 nut driver and go ahead and finish snugging that up there. Okay, that's good. Now, what I'm going to do is take and put my 2 ground terminals on the post. If you can see here, I'm trying to stay out of your view. There's the green wire normally goes to the back ground post, and the black wire ground terminal goes to the front. So what I do is, and I don't want to get this black wire ground terminal too close to this gear, so I keep it on a little bit of an angle back, and then I'm going to take the board and put it over the posts. And again, I was just trying to make sure that black wire wasn't too close to the gear. So then a lot of times you want to make sure, a lot of times I'll move some wires around and make sure my board sits down properly. If you can see, a few threads on the post sticking up, the board is down far enough. Then I'm going to grab little nuts here and just kind of start them, and then come back with my M4 nut driver. And just kind of, again, finger tighten them. And the last thing I'll do is turn the tool over. This might be a little bit hard for you to see. But what I'm doing is pushing up on the blade pin, which had that E-clip on it, and I'm taking the E-clip that goes on the bottom side here and just getting into position. And again, there's a slot on the blade pin, so I'm just kind of getting it lined up. And then what I'm going to do is just snap it forward. Okay, and sometimes it'll wrestle with you a little bit, but I have it in position now and just kind of snapped it in position. Okay, now my inner workings of my tool are completely reassembled. Now I'll be installing my bottom or right hand housing. So what I'm going to do is take the inner workings of the tool and set them down. And a couple things I'd like to point out here is you want to make sure that the rib on the electrical connector is lined up in the slot. And then the other thing is your membrane switch. There's a cutout on the bottom housing. I'll try to lift this up so you can see there's a cutout where it goes. So I'll lift that up and now set it back down. And I'm grabbing my membrane switch here, and I'm just going to set it in position. Sometimes I'll kind of lift these wires up a little bit to slide that underneath here just to help hold it in position. But as you can see, my membrane switch the pad on the membrane switch is seated properly. Alrighty. And then what I do is hold the tool like so, turn it over, and install the screw that goes into the bottom or right hand housing. Okay. A lot of times what I do is I'll take and push the inner workings of the tool, push it towards the back of the tool, push back while I tighten that down just to make sure my rear jaw handle moves nice and freely. Now I'll be installing the top or left-hand housing. And again, I'll make sure all your wires are pushed in position here and everything's seated properly. I've left the screws in, but I'm just kind of sliding them over the top. And what I do is kind of get the top housing snapped into position. Once it snaps into position and your rear jaw handle moves nice and freely, I'll tighten the screws up here. And as you've noticed, I've left this screw out, and that's where my counterbalance holder goes. So I'm just going to take, and the housings are a little wider right there, just slide it into position. And then I'm going to take that screw here, put it through the hole in the counterbalance holder. And then again, just kind of tighten the screws. You don't want to over tighten them because there's brass inserts that screw into the bottom side housing. By the way, if you don't use the counterbalance holder, you don't need to reinstall it in the tool. If this looks like too complicated of a repair, please contact customer service to send the tool in for repair. And that's how you replace the head retainer in your PAT 4.0 hand tool.